The mafia is a basic part of American life, deny it or not. Every generation has had its underworld kings. Unforgettable personalities that commit unspeakable crimes. The mafia, it's a name that speaks fear, representing the fascinating, appalling underside of our national experience.
What did you say about all the accusations? What do you think about it?
Often they've been glorified. We call them names like Al Scarface Capone, Lucky Luciano, or the Dapper Don. Many meet their fates in undignified ways. It's not surprising. They're playing a high-stakes game. The mafia is a business. It turns over more money than America's 10 largest industrial corporations. How did they get this big? Who runs the show? To understand, one has to go back to a quieter, more peaceful time. Back at the turn of the century, America was still a largely white, Anglo-Saxon Protestant country. But the face of America was changing dramatically. The new wave of immigrants jostled the sense of stability of the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, known as WASPs. Many cities became clusters of ethnic neighborhoods, populated by the Irish, the Jewish, the Italians, and others. Most immigrants arrived in the U.S. with very little money. They lived in poverty in city slums, and their lifestyles seemed improper to some WASPs. Local crime was on the increase. Street thefts, prostitution, gambling, and burglaries. And crime was also becoming more violent.
Well, it's been said in the defense of ethnic groups that feel slighted by their association with crime, particularly the Italians, that crime is not an ethnic phenomenon, which it certainly isn't. It certainly goes across all ethnic groups. But one must understand that extreme criminality is often found among groups which are, let's say, the hungriest when they arrive.
There was also another side to it. Many immigrants brought with them a hostile attitude toward the law. The Irish had been oppressed by the British, and for them, opposition to British law was heroic. The Italians from southern Italy felt that the law was unjust, and the Jews fled Eastern Europe because they'd been persecuted and denied the right to own property. So for many, getting around the law was an honored activity. The WASPs feared the changes they were seeing. They wanted to establish more control. They were particularly worried about the drinking habits of the new immigrants. The Anti-Saloon League and other temperance movements were already making their opinions known.
Alcohol is a detriment to youth. I wish that all the youth of America would see it in the same light that I do.
On January 16, 1920, the 18th Amendment to the Constitution became federal law. Enforced by the Volstead Act, it banned liquor sales, production, and consumption. Most just called it Prohibition.
Prohibition was foisted on this country by white Protestants who were worried about the new immigrant groups, worried about social control, and they saw the abolition of the liquor traffic as a way of imposing a kind of social control on these new immigrant groups.
However, many Americans did not want to stop drinking. They'd suffered through World War I, and they wanted to have some fun. A strong demand was created that needed someone to supply it. For many immigrants who were looking for ways to make money, Prohibition was a dream come true. An illegal but highly profitable career as a bootlegger proved irresistible. The Irish were the first bootleggers. In many cities, they were the saloon keepers and bar owners, and they had close ties to the police and to the politicians. Very soon, however, the Irish met fierce competition.
Then when you come down to bootlegging, of course, this would be at precisely the time that the young Italians and the young Jews raised in American slums would be coming to manhood. And there was an opportunity to move quickly into an expanding business activity.
Most newly arrived Americans played the game straight, committed no crimes, and rose by their own legitimate efforts. Gangsters decided to steal and kill not because they were Irish, Jewish, or Italian, but because they were criminals. Ironically for the WASPs, however, criminal circumstances actually worsened as a result of Prohibition.
No one could predict what would happen with Prohibition. People expected it to work. It's an example of the inscrutability of history. Often consequences are unintended, and Prohibition is a classic example of it. No one thought that it would produce an organized crime institution like it did.
The WASPs believed they could use Prohibition to control the recent immigrants. What they didn't know was that a new, defiant attitude toward American justice was taking root. Some Italians believed more in the Mafia Code than in any United States law. And soon, Italian criminals would begin to dominate the other ethnic gangs. But as we'll see, the 1920s were still a time when all the gangs needed each other. Bootleggers connected coast to coast, moving booze. The underworld was becoming coordinated, and organized crime, the Mafia, was born. In turn, the Mafia helped organize American justice. The onset of Prohibition proved an enormous business opportunity for the underworld. What it really spawned were the criminal gangs that we know today. With the passage of the Volstead Act, modern organized crime came together and developed its web-like structure. It was like an event waiting to happen. Many of the early bootleggers had been involved in the newspaper wars. Major newspapers hired gangs of thugs to force news dealers to carry their paper and not the opposition's. It was a natural graduation into the Prohibition liquor trade, where making money and violence went hand in hand. The most violent and the most successful bootlegger in New York was the Irishman Owney Madden, a convicted murderer and gang leader. When illegal bars or speakeasies opened all over New York, many of them served Madden's beer, a brew called Madden's No. 1. Like other successful bootleggers during this time, Madden went from being a nasty small-time killer to running a major underworld business empire.
Owney Madden of New York was a stone killer. He ran that town. Ed Sullivan, who was a Broadway columnist in the 1920s, said that knowing Owney Madden in the 20s was like knowing the mayor.
The story was the same in Boston, a city with a strong Irish community and a history of resistance to Prohibition. Most of the bootleggers had names that we've forgotten today, with one notable exception, Joseph P. Kennedy, the founder of the Kennedy dynasty. During Prohibition, he was already a bank president and making money on the stock market.
So many of the Boston Irish were involved in bootlegging in the 1920s, and I think perhaps Joe did it on one level just to be one of the guys, to have this connection to the old community from which he had sprung and which he had frankly long ago left behind. It's a way of returning to his ethnic roots in East Boston to become a bootlegger.
I think Joe Kennedy did have a natural affinity with other people who saw themselves as fighting the establishment. I don't think there's any doubt that Joseph Kennedy was in contact with a number of mafia characters during the 1920s.
Kennedy kept quiet about his underworld associates, although he would maintain contacts with organized crime figures all his life. His public associates were more refined. When the Harvard class of 1912 had its 10th alumni gathering, Joe played a critical role in making it a roaring success.
And Ralph Lowell of the Boston Lowells, who was the secretary of the class of 1912, later described Joe as our decennial Santa Claus, the man who had provided the booze. Joe's operatives brought the booze ashore in Plymouth, just as the Pilgrims had come ashore in 1620. And it was great stuff. The Harvard reunion in 1922 was very grateful for this high-class booze provided by Joe Kennedy to the class.
Most of his bootlegging activities weren't so altruistic. Bootlegging was a business for Joe, and it helped him launch the Kennedy fortune. It was, of course, also illegal, and the federal government was doing its best to stop the bootleggers. It was a difficult task. Many people didn't respect the law, and their determination to keep drinking demonstrated that creativity was alive and well in the 1920s America. Much of the alcohol came across the Canadian border. Much of it came from another famous family, the Bronfmans of Canada. Sam Bronfman used the Prohibition trade to build the Seagram's empire, which he ran from an office in Montreal.
The Bronfman group were able to set up transshipping companies in the West Indies and even in Mexico, so that what they really did was to set up a transportation system all the way around the United States. West Coast, East Coast, West Indies, and so on.
All of this took sophisticated organization, and it was a major reason why Prohibition eventually led to the creation of organized crime. Moving large amounts of liquor around was quite different from robbing banks or petty extortion. You had to ship the liquor. You had to get it past the Coast Guard. You had to store it in warehouses and sell it to customers. This was big business, and it became the business of organized crime. One of the main masterminds was Arnold Rothstein, who was aptly called the Brain.
Rothstein is significant because his complete, I can only say, intellectual involvement as the Brain marked the emergence of organized crime as a complete business entity. The further elaboration of the syndicate along business lines is generally due to him.
Arnold Rothstein didn't have a gang as most bootleggers did. He was the money man, fronting money for various enterprises, and then being owed money. Rothstein came from a comfortable Orthodox Jewish family on the Upper West Side of New York. He was an inveterate gambler, and legend has it that the notorious 1919 World Series was fixed by Rothstein. It's the greatest scandal in the history of American baseball. 8 members of the Chicago White Sox were bribed to throw the series to the Cincinnati Reds. But it's one fix that Rothstein didn't do. He just heard about the tampering and made a fortune betting on the right side. Rothstein has a pupil, the young Meyer Lansky. Lansky will eventually take over from Rothstein as the mastermind behind the mafia. Lansky is one of the contacts between the bootleggers in New York and Seagram's Liquor in Montreal. He's one of the ways that the Bronfmans moved their booze into the United States. Much of the booze came from Canada or Europe, and one of the most important stepping-off points for this flow of alcohol was a small island about 20 miles off the coast of Newfoundland. The island of St. Pierre, a vestige of the French Empire, was outside the legal jurisdictions of both the United States and Canada. It proved enormously useful to bootleggers like Rothstein and Lansky.
Legal booze would come into St. Pierre from Canada and Europe, be offloaded there, and get fraudulent papers for